COVID-19 and Indigenous Health: The Relationship Between Indigenous Healthcare and Canadian Law by Ashley Jian. Although the rise of the COVID-19 pandemic has had detrimental effects on arguably everyone around the world, one group particularly affected by this widespread pandemic is the Indigenous peoples of Canada. As a marginalized group within Canada, the Indigenous are disproportionately at risk for COVID-19 and thus require specific measures from the state to safeguard these communities. Although the Canadian government has given extra funding to Indigenous groups to aid with the impacts of the coronavirus disease, researchers emphasize how the COVID-19 pandemic highlights the need for additional government initiatives to eliminate existing health issues that lead to the Indigenous' disproportionate risk to the coronavirus. These various issues include overcrowded housing, unclean water, food insecurity, and the remote locations that many Indigenous peoples are situated in. All of these problems are evidence of the persisting effects of colonialism that the Canadian state inflicted upon the Indigenous peoples from the start of the 19th century to as recently as the end of the 20th century. Colonialism was exercised using the policies of displacement and assimilation, which involved forcibly relocating Indigenous peoples to unfavorable lands, as well as the overarching goal of eradicating Indigenous peoples and their distinct traditions and ways of life. These colonialist perspectives are still maintained through the current laws that govern healthcare in Canada. The disproportionate risk that Indigenous citizens face to COVID-19 demonstrates how healthcare laws perpetuate an inferior standard of living for Indigenous peoples that are in line with colonialist policies of displacement and assimilation, disregarding Indigenous legal traditions. This argument will be exhibited throughout this presentation by analyzing Canadian legislation that connects to the issue of Indigenous healthcare, such as Section 7 and Section 15 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Analysis of these laws display the lack of consideration for mindful implementation of Indigenous legal traditions into Aboriginal law, and how this disregard results in continuous disproportionate hardships for Indigenous lives. Colonialism was applied in Canada using legal means such as the Indian Act, which was the primary vehicle through which Canada marginalized its Indigenous peoples. The Act imposed stifling control over Indigenous peoples, for example, defining who was legally an Aboriginal person, restricting contact with non-Indigenous people, or banning spiritual practices, and more. There are two specific policies which upheld the implementation of colonialist ideology: displacement and assimilation. Displacement involved the Canadian state forcibly relocating Indigenous peoples to unfavorable lands. This policy was largely so colonialist governments could use traditional Indigenous territories for their own economic development. Assimilation, on the other hand, is the overarching colonialist goal of eradicating Indigenous peoples and their distinct traditions and ways of life. There are two prominent examples of assimilation as seen through Canada's history. One is the painful history of residential schools, boarding schools where Indigenous children were forced to give up their cultural and religious traditions and were often subject to horrific mental, physical, and sexual violence at the hands of the government and the Christian Church. Another example is the 60s scoop, where, in the 1960s to the 1980s, Indigenous children were uprooted from their homes and placed in the foster care system for adoption by white Canadian families. After these children were removed, there were no further efforts to reconnect them to their communities or cultural identity. Through these laws, supported by the ideology of colonialism, the Canadian state engaged in a policy of cultural genocide against the Indigenous peoples. The picture used in the background of this slide is a popular painting titled The Scream by Cray artist Kent Monkman. It is a visual representation of the assimilationist events that took place with horrific violence towards Indigenous populations. On this slide, you can see visual representations of some of the historical events of colonialism. The picture on the left depicts Indigenous children posing for the camera with a Catholic priest. This picture was taken in a residential school. Although the children are smiling, the picture on the top right demonstrates the reality of this situation. The main goal of these residential schools was to kill the Indian in the child, a famous phrase that encapsulates the assimilationist goals of the Canadian legal system at the time. These photos demonstrate the reality of assimilation and help us realize how an entire generation of Indigenous children being forced to unlearn their own culture hugely eradicates the presence of Indigenous cultures and is ultimately successful in enacting cultural genocide. The picture on the bottom right is a newspaper advertisement for Indigenous children during the 60s scoop. As you can see, the headline for both ads read, "A child is waiting," and describes both children in positive terms respectively as happy, playful girl and youngster who loves outdoors. These advertisements downplay the tragic effects of placing Indigenous children in the foster care system, ultimately promoting the eradication of Indigenous language and culture and displaying a blatant disregard for Indigenous ways of life. It is important to note that the effects of colonialism are not over. Some of the issues that Indigenous peoples still face today are disproportionate risk to overcrowded housing, lack of clean water, food insecurity, and the remote locations where their reserves are often situated. These ongoing effects represent the generational trauma faced by Indigenous people due to colonial events. For example, the remote locations of many Indigenous reserves directly relates to the physical displacement of Indigenous peoples from their lands under colonial policy, as mentioned in the previous slide. Due to this colonial history impacting these current social issues, Indigenous peoples continue to face disproportionate inequalities in comparison to other Canadian citizens. On this slide, you can see visual representations of the ongoing effects of colonialism on Indigenous peoples. The picture on the left is from a food insecurity protest in northern Canada. On the poster behind the Indigenous girl, you can see that in the north, milk is priced at $7.99 and juice at $16.39. There are many factors that impact food insecurity, but the high prices for food in the north are in part due to the remote communities, which then further isolates Indigenous peoples and leaves them precarious due to the displacement efforts which have taken place in colonial history. The picture on the top right depicts a boil water advisory. At any given time, there are over 100 drinking water advisories in Indigenous communities across Canada, a major human rights violation under the United Nations. Finally, the photo on the bottom right demonstrates the poor housing conditions of many Indigenous homes. These various social issues are a result of the historical events of colonialism. As noted through these various photos, just because Canada formally apologized for its historical actions towards the Indigenous does not mean that reconciliation and equality is achieved. The novel COVID-19 pandemic demonstrates the effects of the Canadian legal system on Indigenous peoples today. On March 11, 2020, the World Health Organization officially declared COVID-19, the newfound coronavirus, to be a pandemic. The COVID-19 pandemic has changed the world's definition of normal. Terms such as social distancing have become of common usage, and facial masks, which were rarely used before, have become commonplace in any public location you may go to. As you can see on the bottom right, public places have become deserted, with people self-isolating in their homes in order to stop further spread of this disease. As a marginalized group within Canada, the Indigenous are disproportionately at risk for COVID-19 and thus require specific measures from the state to safeguard these communities. On March 18, 2020, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau declared the $300 million Indigenous Community Support Fund, which mostly went towards organizations representing First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities for COVID-19. Moreover, on May 21, 2020, PM Trudeau declared that the federal government will give an additional $75 million to off-reserve Indigenous services to aid with the impacts of the coronavirus. Although this government funding specifically towards Indigenous communities exhibits that the government recognizes the unequal health risks for Indigenous peoples, researchers emphasize how the COVID-19 pandemic highlights the need for additional government initiatives to eliminate existing health issues that disproportionately affect the Indigenous and have ultimately led to their heightened risk to COVID-19, such as insufficient housing and unequal access to food and clean water. For example, the lack of clean water in Indigenous communities demonstrates how Indigenous peoples are disproportionately at risk for the newfound coronavirus because of the issues they already face due to the history of colonialism. I mentioned a couple slides ago how there are currently more than 100 drinking water advisories for various Indigenous communities across Canada. A key recommendation for protecting yourself against COVID-19 is washing your hands frequently. Without clean water, Indigenous peoples are unable to follow these virus protection techniques and are thus more at risk. The COVID-19 pandemic demonstrates that the effects of colonialism are not over. Rather, they are continuous and ongoing. Canadian healthcare laws are one way in which colonialist perspectives are maintained and reproduce an inferior standard of living for Indigenous peoples. Therefore, the COVID-19 pandemic exhibits a real-life, contemporary example of how Indigenous lives are subjected to an inferior quality in part through Canadian healthcare. Section 7 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms gives Canadian citizens the right to life, liberty, and security of the person, and the right not to be deprived thereof except in accordance with the principles of fundamental justice. Section 7 allows for the argument that the uneven access to quality healthcare for Indigenous peoples is a violation against one's right to security. However, there is also no legal obligation for the government to provide healthcare services, allowing Canada to evade from a more aggressive implementation of better healthcare for Indigenous communities. Therefore, Section 7 serves as a legal scapegoat, if you will, that helps the Canadian state to continue avoiding Indigenous issues. The greater risks that Indigenous peoples have to COVID-19 demonstrate an example of the consequences of Canadian law, as it exhibits a real-life, contemporary situation of how Canadian legislation reproduces an inadequate quality of living for Indigenous citizens. Section 15 of the Canadian Charter gives Canadians their equality rights. It reads, "Every individual is equal before and under the law and has the right to the equal protection and equal benefit of the law without discrimination, and, in particular, without discrimination based on race, national or ethnic origin, color, religion, sex, age, or mental or physical disability." This section of the Charter allows for the argument that Indigenous peoples do not equally benefit from the healthcare laws in Canada due to their pre-existing disadvantage, imposed upon them by the colonialist actions of the Canadian state in the past. These actions include the examples explained in the previous slides, such as residential schools, the 60 Scoop, which were applied through the colonialist policies of displacement and assimilation. Despite these rights, however, Section 15 provides a weak basis for Aboriginal peoples asserting their equal rights to healthcare due to the fact that non-Indigenous people who live around or on reserves face the same challenges to healthcare access. Therefore, poor healthcare for Indigenous is not a problem of equality based on race, national, or ethnic origin, and Section 15 is unable to serve as a strong legal foundation for Indigenous peoples to assert their needs to better quality healthcare through Canada's legal system. Indigenous peoples' heightened risk to COVID-19 represents a contemporary example of the results of these inequitable laws, and how the Canadian legal system is structured against the Indigenous, ultimately perpetuating their current inequitable lifestyles. As illustrated throughout this presentation, Indigenous peoples are disproportionately at risk for COVID-19. This disproportionate risk is a result of colonialism. The Canadian state's historical policy of cultural genocide has resulted in inferior living standards for Indigenous peoples today. Healthcare laws are one way in which the Canadian legal system perpetuates a substandard quality of life for Indigenous peoples. This was exhibited in this presentation by analyzing Sections 7 and 15 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Section 7 is a legal scapegoat in how the right to life, liberty, and security for Indigenous peoples ultimately does not legally oblige the Canadian state to provide better healthcare services for Indigenous communities. Section 15 brings up questions of inequality for Indigenous citizens in terms of healthcare, as well as addressing their pre-existing disadvantage due to colonialism, yet is ultimately a weak premise for Aboriginal peoples to legally assert their need for better healthcare. The COVID-19 pandemic serves as a current example of how Canadian law ultimately works to perpetuate a substandard healthcare system and quality of life for Indigenous people through its laws. Although these are substantially heavy issues, there are ways that we citizens can work to enact change in our laws to better the living standards for Indigenous communities. These include continuing to engage in meaningful research about Indigenous issues, raising awareness through social media, protests, and/or donating to organizations that advocate for Indigenous rights. Reconciliation is a difficult task, but it is nonetheless an important and necessary one, and it will involve continuous effort from individuals all around the world to come to terms with the colonial legacy underlying our country, as well as the continuous effects of such a history. Thank you for listening to my presentation.